Hi, everybody. Wanted to record and talk a little bit about Unity and how that works as a designer. And we're looking at the idea of the whole is better than the sum of all of its parts. So this is related to principle of design, and these are ways that we can use layout, we use elements, we use space, we use all those components to make an idea of what we're trying to communicate to that particular audience. So unity is one, balance is another, emphasis, rhythm, motion, and scale. And a way to remember that is just burp them. I don't know if that's a good one or a bad one, but that's just a way to remember them. And they're not in any particular order other than just being able to repeat. So let's look at unity a little bit. Looking at the whole or more importantly, more to begin with than the individual parts. We want it to be unified. And we want to add a little bit of variety too as we go along, but how can we use the elements to create this unity? If you look at this example of these tendrils of pumpkins, a lot of leaves, a lot of stems, but then there's some variety in here. So kind of repeat that idea of variety. And if you look at them, some are open, some are closed, some are left, some are right. If you look at the actual photograph, some are tall, some are skinny, some are wide, some are short. Some of them, if you go even deeper, some are more grayscale, some are more soft with the use of value, and even some of them have these red X's. So we have a little bit of variety, even though it's just this repeated set of shapes and figures. Where we see this in type is the idea of, where we see unity is through type in design. And we want things, even though we have variety, we might have a bold versus a regular versus an italic. We see those, but they're related. A font family is related, so it has the same strokes, it has the same use of finishing parts and feet, things like that. What we want is organization, and how can we get everything together? That's what unity means. And it's this idea of Gestalt, which is the unified whole. Everything is tied together. How do we, and even thinking about how the viewer sees it, how the person looking at your composition, we look for it. That's the way our mind works. It's kind of interesting to think about. So here, do you see two large groups created from similar squares, smaller squares? Or do you see 20 plus individuals? Well, the space in between them kind of pushes it back maybe so that you see two larger groups first. Perhaps. Because that negative space, that empty space is helpful. So how can you use that in a design? Our brains are pretty incredible. And if you think about how we group things, just thinking of similarity. So you might see groups of circles, 2x2 square shape of circles. You might also see a plus sign relating to that. So our minds look for similar shapes and we group them together. Because grouping actually gives it a new shape. So this is just repeating the scale of circles, but it's just circles and lines. But then this connection of them turns it into the letter M. So here are the principles we're going to look at within Gestalt or within unity. The idea of proximity, the idea of similarity, continuation, closure, and figure and ground. First one here, proximity, is the nearness of one and another. And we see these as groups, because similar to those squares we just saw, we saw them as a group, and we saw that as one group versus another group. They belong together in their proximity. If we just put things in the corners, all we might look at really is the negative space in between. So when we group things, putting things closer together helps us unify them. That's one easy way, grouping things that are related. Some samples here. What do you see? Do you see figures, but actually a tree? Do you see individual bombs being dropped? Or do you see them as groups? That might indicate when where that might tell you how many planes were involved. Just using these lines in a particular format shows us the IBM logo. Just repeating those lines. On the right, you see Unilever, and overall you see the letter U, but when you go in closer, you see ice cream, or you see a bee, or you see a tree, or coffee, or a fish. You see all different kinds of little things that come together to make that mark. Interestingly enough, that idea can be taken on, and it's often repeated. I'm not saying design is bad being repeated, but that's done quite a bit. So how do you come up with an idea that challenges you and challenges the viewer and doesn't just take from somebody else? But again, using that shape, that texture, that imagery in a specific format, but proximity gives you that unity. Similarity is giving or using things that are similar or repeating. So it could be repeating shapes, it could be repeating textures, it could be repeating colors and directions. But I want to emphasize here that we can benefit to have a little variety. So it's repeating things with a little variety. Could be repeating these arrows that actually shows a racetrack. Changing the color, changing the layering, changing the scale, changing the arc of the circle. On the right, you might see just this circle, but a bunch of circles looks like an apple perhaps, but they're rotated differently. The negative space changes, the amount showing there, the color changes, the scale changes, where those negative spaces actually are. Little variety, but it seems all unified. Again, playing with use of line and color and angles, or repeating shapes that come into, or figures that come into the background. Similar color, similar angle, but different actual specific items. Done for a mark. For another one, just repeating color. On the right, you see the letter C first, perhaps, but when you look at that, you look to the right, and that triangle might make the letter A. Above that might make a letter O. The blue one, the square, is a little bit more difficult to quickly notice, but it actually represents the letter M. So that unifies all of those. Fascinating logo here for sun. It's taking the basic shape for the letter U, repeating it, flipping it, rotating it to make the word sun, and you can read it around 4 different ways. Continuation guides the viewer through, thinking of one object and goes to the next. And we've looked at these a lot with leading lines, implied lines, or psychic lines. How can we use those? But continuation is helpful as designers and to build unity. If you look at this square as the first component, and you might go up or down, but the triangles are pointing in a completely different direction. So you want to pay attention to how you might rotate those to guide the viewer. You're still showing the same elements, but how do you guide the viewer around? With this one, we just see this animal in the center in green kind of as this curved line, and we start maybe at the left and then work our way to the right, and the butterflies just kind of add some interest. So just as an illustration, it's just repetition and a little variety. Coca-Cola uses that as well. It's this leading lines to guide the viewer through, the curved lines. Continuity is a little bit different than continuation. Continuity actually uses a grid, and it's a really helpful design tool that you can use. We're not going to use it just yet, and as we move on, you'll understand the benefits of using a grid, but continuity from page to page to page in something like a book is really helpful. From a website is really helpful. So we use a grid, so we know that there's continuation that way. Closure is this idea of we don't need to finish an entire shape. We can leave things incomplete. That's okay. It's okay. We can close it for sure, but we can use the idea of the mind of the viewer kind of fixing that. So you might see 3 Pac-Mans But if you look a little bit closer, you might see a triangle. Just with the negative space, our mind works pretty well. We don't need to draw the face of this panda, the head of where the ears are. We understand it. We can do that. Along with that is the idea of figure and ground, and we've explored this already. It's the positive and the negative, the foreground and the background. How can we use that as a design benefit, as a way to bring things together? It might be, when we look at this on the left, it's that positive and negative play that you see in different shapes, but then you actually see it as a soccer ball. On the right, you might notice the arrow between the E and the X. That negative space, that play of figure and ground, tells you they're moving on, right? So they deliver. Here we have some other samples of logos that use the negative space too. What do you see? We can explore that. What do you see on the left? You might see the Spartan. You might also see the golfer. On the right, you might see, again, two figures in the continent of Africa, or someone's face and then a peacock. So how can we as designers use similarity, proximity, continuity, closure, continuation? Can we use leading lines to guide the viewer through, to continue from one part to the next, or direct the viewer? How can you use these in your project? So here are some quick examples as we look at them. How are these visuals alike? Well, we have a lot of the same shapes. We play with scale. They have the same color. They play with space. They're unified by color and shape. Unified by color and shape. Guiding the viewer through that play of foreground and background. Playing with what the space is between things. We might see elements a little bit different. This is not the correct map, but this is a map that often looks like London. And you have this really, really complex data that you're trying to communicate. And if you follow the lines, you notice that it's train paths. And there are dots, but using color helps you understand what direction you're going from one area to the next. Again, it's unified with a little bit of variety. Book covers. What do you see here that links them all together? And then what's the variety between them? With packaging, different shapes, different scales, what do you see that links everything together? Using the idea of similarity, the idea of proximity, of continuity, of continuation, of figure and ground, of closure, guiding the viewer through. How can you use those? We don't just want to look like we've kind of thrown up on the page, right? I know this is a photograph and you're going down the street, but what do you see first? One of you might see something first, another one might see something else first. We don't want to just we want to play with variety to give importance to something. Yeah, they're all signs, but how do we make it unified in a more helpful way from there? And we don't want to just repeat and repeat and repeat. We want to have that variety. How could you make that work? Well, we want it to be unified, but we don't want it to be exact. The idea of similarity, the idea of continuation, guiding the viewer through, repeating shapes, playing with the positive and negative for closure, bringing things closer together to see the overall shape can help, and play with the figure and ground, the foreground and background. Another way of looking at it, thinking of proximity, thinking of continuity, similarity, closure, Thinking of symmetry as well. Those are some other in different ways of looking at it, common fate. But how can you use these elements to create a unified whole? Keep that in the back of your mind as you are working. The whole of the visual image is different from and greater than the sum of its parts. How can you use similar styling? How can you use similar colors, maybe similar type? Thinking about proximity, continuation, how can you use unity?